Section C, has committed adultery in the heart. The key phrase. General Audience number 42 of October 1st, 1980. In our analysis, we have come to the third part of Christ's statement in the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28. The first part was, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' The second part, 'But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to desire her,' is grammatically connected with the third part, 'has already committed adultery with her in his heart.' The method used here, that of dividing, of breaking Christ's statement into three parts that follow each other, may seem artificial. Yet, when we seek the ethical meaning of the whole statement, in its totality, the division of the text that we used can be helpful, as long as we do not merely set the pieces apart, but bring them together. And this is what we intend to do. Each of the distinct parts has its own content and connotations that are specific to it. And this is precisely what we want to show by the division of the text. But, at the same time, one should point out that each of the parts must be explained in direct relation with the others. This point holds in the first place for the main semantic elements through which the statement constitutes a whole. Here are the elements: to commit adultery, to desire, to commit adultery in the body, and to commit adultery in the heart. It would be particularly difficult to identify the ethical meaning of desire without the last element, adultery in the heart. The analysis above has to some degree already considered this element. Still, a fuller understanding of the component to commit adultery in the heart is possible only after a separate analysis. As we said already at the beginning, the meaning we are looking for is the ethical meaning. See the TOB Audience number 34, paragraph 2. Christ's statement in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28 takes as its starting point the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery," to show how it is to be understood and put into practice so that the justice willed by God Yahweh as legislator might abound in it, so that it might abound in a measure greater than the one resulting from the interpretation and casuistry of the teachers of the Old Testament. If Christ's words intend in this sense to build the new ethos on the basis of the same commandment, the road to this aim passes through the rediscovery of the values that had been lost in the general understanding of the Old Testament and in the application of this commandment. From this point of view, the formulation of the text of Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28 is significant as well. The commandment, "You shall not commit adultery," is formulated as a prohibition that categorically excludes a certain moral evil. In addition to "You shall not commit adultery," the same law, the Decalogue, contains also the prohibition, "You shall not desire your neighbor's wife," from Exodus chapter 20, verse 14 and 17, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 18 and 21. Christ does not make one commandment pointless in favor of another. Although he speaks about desire, he aims at a deeper clarification of adultery. It is significant that after quoting the prohibition, "You shall not commit adultery," as a prohibition known to his audience, he changes his style and logical structure in what follows in the course of his statement from normative to narrative affirmative. When he says, "Whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery with her in his heart," he describes an inner fact, the reality of which can be easily understood by his audience. At the same time, through the fact described and qualified in this way, he shows how the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery," should be understood in order to lead to the justice willed by the legislator. We have thus reached the expression, "has committed adultery in the heart," which seems to be the key expression for understanding its correct ethical meaning. This expression is at the same time the main source for revealing the essential values of the new ethos, the ethos of the Sermon on the Mount. As is often the case in the Gospel, here too we are faced with a certain paradox. How, in fact, can adultery take place without committing adultery? That is, without an external act that allows one to identify the act prohibited by the law. We have seen to what degree the casuistry of the teachers of the law attempted to give an exact account of this problem. Quite apart from casuistry, however, it seems evident that adultery can only be identified in the flesh. That is, when the two, the man and the woman who unite with each other in such a way that they become one flesh, see Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, are not spouses. That is, husband and wife in the legal sense. What possible meaning can adultery committed in the heart thus have? Is this not a merely metaphorical expression used by the teacher to emphasize the sinfulness of concupiscence? A first reading. If we granted such a semantic reading of Christ's statement, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, we would have to reflect deeply about the ethical consequences that would follow from it. That is, about the conclusions concerning the ethical order of behavior. Adultery occurs when the man and the woman unite with each other so as to become one flesh. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. That is, in a manner proper to spouses, are not spouses in the legal sense. The identification of adultery as a sin committed in the body is strictly and exclusively tied to the external act, to shared conjugal life, which is related also to the state of life of the acting persons recognized by society. In this case before us, this state of life is inappropriate and does not authorize such an act, hence precisely the term adultery. Moving on to the second part of Christ's statement, in which the configuration of the new ethos begins, one would have to understand the expression, whoever looks at a woman to desire her, only in reference to persons according to their civil state of life recognized by society, that is, whether they're married or not. Here the questions begin to multiply. Since there is no doubt that Christ points to the sinfulness of the interior act of concupiscence expressed by the act of looking at any woman who is not the wife of the one who looks at her in this way, we can and even must ask if by the same expression he allows and improves such a look, such an interior act of concupiscence, when it's directed toward the woman who is the wife of the man who looks at her in this way. An argument in favor of an affirmative answer seems to be following the logical premise. In our case, only the man who is the potential subject of adultery in the flesh can commit adultery in the heart. Since this subject cannot be a married man in relation to his own legitimate wife, adultery in the heart cannot refer to him, but one can ascribe it as a fault in the case of every other man. If he is the husband, he cannot commit it in relation to his own wife. Only he has the exclusive right to desire, to look with concupiscence at the woman who is his wife, and one can never say that on account of such an interior act he deserves being accused of adultery committed in the heart. If in virtue of marriage he has the right of uniting with his wife so that the two will be one flesh, one can never call this act adultery. By analogy, the interior act of desire which the Sermon on the Mount speaks about cannot be defined as adultery committed in the heart. See Theology of the Body, Audience 25, paragraph 4. This interpretation of Christ's words in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28 seems to correspond to the logic of the Decalogue, which contains the commandment, you shall not desire your neighbor's wife, the 9th commandment, in addition to the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, the 6th commandment. Besides, the reasoning in support of this interpretation has all the characteristics of objective correctness and accuracy. Nevertheless, there are fundamental doubts whether this reasoning takes into account all the aspects of revelation and of the theology of the body that should be considered, above all when we want to understand Christ's words. We have already seen some time ago the great specific weight of these words, the wealth of the anthropological and theological implications of the one sentence in which Christ goes back to the beginning. See Matthew chapter 19, verse 8. The anthropological and theological implications of the statement in the Sermon on the Mount in which Christ appeals to the human heart give also to that statement its own specific gravity and make it consistent with the teaching of the gospel as a whole. For this reason, we must admit that the interpretation presented above, despite all its objective correctness and logical precision, needs to be broadened and above all deepened. We must remember that the reference to the human heart, expressed perhaps in a paradoxical way from Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, comes from him who knew what was in every man. John chapter 2, verse 25. And while his words confirm the commandments of the Decalogue, not only the 6th but also the 9th, they express at the same time the knowledge about man that allows us, as we emphasized elsewhere, see Theology of the Body, Audience 4, paragraph 3, to unite the awareness of human sinfulness with the perspective of the redemption of the body. See Romans chapter 8, verse 23. Precisely such knowledge stands at the basis of the new ethos that emerges from the words of the Sermon on the Mount. Taking all of this into account, we conclude that just as in the understanding of adultery in the flesh, Christ criticizes the erroneous and one-sided interpretation of adultery that stems from the failure to observe monogamy. That is, marriage understood as the indefectible covenant of persons. So also in understanding adultery in the heart, Christ takes into consideration not only the real juridical state of life of the man and woman in question. Christ makes the moral evaluation of desire depend above all on the personal dignity of the man and the woman. And this is important both in the case of unmarried persons and perhaps even more so in the case of spouses, husband and wife. From this point of view, we should complete the analysis of the words from the Sermon on the Mount, and we shall do so next time.